This is the story of the greatest war of world history. It's the story of a terrible time, an age when the most wicked evils were perpetrated. 74 million were to die, 5.5 million Germans, 21 million Chinese, 21 million Russians, 6 million Jews, and 3.5 million Japanese. The images of the past send a message through time, a warning from the past, lest we forget. March 1933. A new Chancellor of Germany is elected. He does not seize power with conspiracy. He uses no violence. He is made Chancellor according to the laws of German democracy. A democracy he has openly and truthfully promised to destroy. He promises openly and truthfully to end the unfinished business of World War I, with blood if need be. He is Adolf Hitler. World War II was unfinished business. Without knowledge of the great European War of 1914 to 1918, we cannot comprehend the war that convulsed the world from 39 to 45. Even the fighting that tore across the remotest Pacific islands and the densest Asian jungle cannot be understood. The leaders of the world in 1939 were men shaped by the First World War. Hitler had seen the war at first hand as an infantryman in the trenches of the Western Front. And there were older men who had seen a generation of the young lost, consumed by an industrial war machine. When these men took part in the post-war cult of the war dead, laying wreaths at monuments across the continent, they felt the presence of millions of souls standing behind them. To understand how and why war returned to Europe in 1939 is to understand how and why war came to Europe in 1914, and how and why that conflict ended. The cause of war in 1914 was the simple problem of Germany, of how the then new country of Germany could be accepted as a great power by other, much older powers, France, Russia, and Britain. In a tangle of alliances, a climate of aggressive rivalry between these countries burst into war. World War I ended in a strange anticlimax. It's hard for us to remember that after a massive victory in the East, ending in abject Russian surrender and the conquest of vast lands, Germany itself collapsed to defeat without being invaded. Many Germans believed that their armies had been stabbed in the back, betrayed, not defeated at all. The fighting stopped suddenly in 1918 with the armistice. Armistice is a word that means truce, a temporary halt to fighting. The First World War was supposedly ended by the Versailles Conference and Treaty. A summit of France, Britain, Italy, and America met to decide on a system of security that would guarantee peace in Europe. Lenin's new revolutionary government in the Soviet Union was not invited. Germany was summoned only to sign the resulting treaty. The French demanded that the treaty formally blamed Germany for starting the war. Britain saw the war more as a terrible mistake. Every line of the treaty followed from the supposed German guilt. The guarantee of peace was to be the punishment and weakening of Germany. In fact, each line was a recipe for a future renewed war. Germany lost territory in the east where huge areas had been won from Soviet Russia. These gains of what in later years would be called Lebensraum, living space, were taken away and used to create a new nation, Poland. A high-minded and noble idea was that states should be decided by nationality. Therefore, the Polish had a country of their own, rather than living as minorities in Germany or Russia. But in drawing the new map of Europe, the principle of nationality was forgotten at Germany's expense. The new Poland was given access to the sea, and in the process millions of Germans became a minority in Poland. The new Czechoslovakia was to be given defendable borders and included millions of Germans, the Sudeten Germans, and a minority of disaffected Slovaks. Contrary to the basic principle of nationality, German-speaking Austria was forbidden to unite with Germany, lest the two countries combine their strength. Versailles created a Europe where Germany, still a big, powerful country, was bordered in the east by weak, smaller countries with whom Germany now had scores to settle. The fighting had devastated huge areas of northern France and nearly bankrupted the economies of both Britain and France. The Versailles settlement insisted that Germany pay reparations. Huge sums were to be paid to pay off the debts of France and Britain, repaying money loaned by America. The sums were unimaginably large, crippling the German economy. Versailles imposed military humiliation upon Germany, insisting the Rhineland, that area of Germany adjacent to France, be demilitarized. The German army, the largest in Europe, was to be cut to 100,000, not enough to defend Germany, let alone start a war. The army was to have no modern weapons, tanks or aircraft that had revolutionized World War I. The German Navy was to have no U-boats. Versailles established the League of Nations, which would provide a forum in which international security could be policed and aggression contained. As the people of Europe mourned a lost generation, they lived in a continent where the tensions that had torn the nations apart remained, and upon which had been layered new resentments and new grievances. Now, the most powerful country in Europe remained with its strength, size, industry, economy, and population intact, and with a whole catalog of further grievances. And the success of Versailles as a system for peace and security depended on German cooperation. If Germany refused to pay, if she rearmed, if she moved troops into the Rhineland, the only option open to France and Britain was to restart the ghastly horror of the Western Front, to renew the war, fought to end all wars. Versailles was weakened from the start. The British thought the settlement unfair and unrealistic, the French that the punishment of Germany had not gone far enough, that the only punishment of German breach was war, total war, made international relations a high-risk game, made for a bold individual gambler. What of the United States, the power whose entry into the war in 1917 had weighed the scales against Germany? The USA turned in upon itself, concerning itself with the 1920s and all that decade means for American history. Having entered into world affairs, the United States turned its back on Europe, the Congress refusing to ratify the treaty, refusing to join the League. The oceanic distances separating the old from the new world seemed to provide insurance from the problems of Europe. The map of Europe was now a map to war, the history determined and awaiting the minds and the wills to act out the script. Already, as Hitler took power in 1933, the system of reparations had collapsed amidst the world economic crisis. For 13 years, reparations had been a major issue keeping the war alive. Germany had lurched from financial disaster to disaster. Any individual German's money troubles, the great inflation and the huge unemployment of the 1920s were laid at the feet of Britain and France. The Germans felt robbed, the French swindled, but the Germans were trying not to pay. The British saw reparations as part of the problem, feeling their abandonment would bring about a European economic recovery. A run on banks in the early 1930s had caused the payments to be written off and had discredited the German government, helping bring Hitler to power. The 13 years of fighting over money helped destroy the Versailles settlement. Britain came to regard everything the French said about Germany as bad sense, the French to feel disillusioned. The story of the interwar years is complicated, and it's just too easy to see a plot by Hitler, some system at work. Hitler was a dreamer of great schemes, but whether events followed his plan is debatable. Plans and systems are imposed by history on events which are random, on the actions of individuals that are spontaneous and improvised. Plans may exist, dreams may be dreamt, but the gap between idea and reality is large. Hitler presented the German people with one big idea: the destruction of what he called the Slave Treaty of Versailles, and to once more make Germany a power. Hitler's policy from taking power in 1933 was a succession of acts, each a line-by-line deletion of Versailles. One of the great paradoxes of Hitler, one of the many ways in which other political leaders and the ordinary voter in all countries misread Hitler and Nazism, was in believing that Hitler was like every other politician, capable of saying anything out of office, but doing something very different when in real power. Hitler was a politician of action and did just what he said he would do. He promised to abandon democracy. He claimed it the enemy of strong leadership, and at the first opportunity proceeded to set about that very destruction. 1 month after Hitler took office, the German parliament, the Reichstag, burnt to the ground. It was arson. The attack upon the center of German democracy is shrouded in conspiracy theory. The controversy is central to the history of Nazi Germany. The Nazis blamed communists and claimed the arson was the prelude to a communist coup, a plot to establish a Soviet Germany. Indeed, in the polarized and extreme politics of Germany at that time, that was the goal of the Nazis' Bolshevik enemies. The alleged arsonist was Marinus van der Lubbe, a young Dutch communist arrested in the building that night. His voice is silent as he was tried, condemned, and executed. History will forever turn over and question the events of that night in Berlin. Was van der Lubbe the patsy of the Nazis, who started the fire themselves to create a crisis they would then exploit? Was van der Lubbe the tool of a real communist plot? Was there no plot, but an imagined plot that a paranoid Hitler thought real? Was van der Lubbe the lone gunman, responsible for the whole attack himself? History can only show with certainty the result of the fire, the physical and the political destruction of German democracy. The Nazis used the emergency to suspend parliamentary democracy and arrest and imprison all communist and socialist opponents. The office of Chancellor was combined with that of President. Head of government became head of state. The army swore personal loyalty to Adolf Hitler, and a parliamentary democracy became a dictatorship. Vague and fanciful ideas of Jewish responsibility for the war, which seemed eccentric when the Nazis were an opposition party, were turned into real action. According to Hitler, the Jews sought the destruction of the Aryan Nordic German peoples, and it caused war between Britain and Germany. Hitler believed the Jews were using Slav people via Soviet communism to threaten the German race. The result was persecution of Jewish people and businesses, both formal and informal, that spread to all parts of German society.
Wir haben 4 Jahre damals uns ausgebeten und wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hitler did as he promised. He said he would end unemployment and did so, implementing policy that was a German New Deal, a recovery program that was every bit as successful as that of Roosevelt in the USA. Money was pumped into the economy through vast public works, directly and indirectly creating jobs, raising the level of demand and productivity throughout Germany. A lasting image of the 1930s is of Hitler and other Nazis proudly opening autobahns, futurist highways of a new age. It was a more ruthless New Deal than Roosevelt's, the destruction of trades unions making the manipulation of the economy easier than in America. The great parades of Nazism, stupefying to the eye, were the genuine expression of a nation willingly, gladly, and gratefully marching symbolically and actually in step with the will of one man. Already in 1933, the system of reparations had collapsed. Hitler first made an attack upon the principle of disarmament. Hitler's predecessors in government had been party to a lengthy conference of disarmament demanding revision of the treaty. Hitler, sensing France too weak to do anything and Britain thinking the treaty unfair, simply walked out of discussions and ordered rearmament. It was a gamble. The French raged, but as Germany began to once more launch U-boats, began openly to develop tanks, as the skies began to fill with the embryonic Luftwaffe, nothing happened. Hitler had challenged the British and French to fight. The gamble paid off. Nothing happened. Hitler simply left the League of Nations, and nothing happened. In March 1935, Germany reclaimed the Saarland. Yet another chapter of Versailles and the post-war settlement unraveled. The Saar was a small but economically important area of Germany adjacent to the French border and was seized by France at the end of World War I. The Versailles Treaty promised that after 15 years of French occupation, the population of the Saar could vote to choose French rule, German rule, or independence. It was now 2 years into Hitler's regime. Any Saarlander knew that union with Germany meant joining an aggressive militaristic dictatorship, that it would be a democratic vote to end democracy. The people of the Saar were as educated, as intelligent as any European people. The issues at stake were fully and openly debated. The French made a strong and attractive case for retention of their rule. The voting was free and fair, internationally monitored. 98% chose Germany, chose Nazism, chose Hitler. Each and every European of those times played a greater or lesser part in the coming of war. If the leading player on the stage of Europe was Hitler, the supporting character was Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. Mussolini and Italy's story may be just as well explained as a desire for greatness. The Italian fascists came to power many years before the German Nazis, for reasons much the same. Although on the victorious side in World War I, Italy had felt cheated of the due and just spoils in the peace. Mussolini created fascism as a dynamic politics of the future and had abolished democracy. Nazism had borrowed many basic political and visual ideas from fascism. The central difference between the two leaders was the relationship each had between actions and words. Mussolini boasted and bragged, talked of power, but in reality, Italy was a weak country, without the inherent strength, the wealth, resources, and the industry to back up proud words. Mussolini felt himself the creator of fascism and senior to Hitler. In later years, Mussolini, confronted with Hitler's successes, was impelled to somehow put his boasts into action. These policies of vanity and envy would desperately weaken the strategy of the Italian-German alliance. In 1935, Italy invaded the African country of Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, and the only African state until then independent, a feudal monarchy ruled by a god-king Haile Selassie. The two countries had fought in the 19th century, when Italy had been defeated by an African army. Mussolini wanted revenge. Abyssinia had plans of imperial expansion of its own, conflicting with Italian interests spreading from Somalia. Why did Mussolini send his forces into battle when he did? It was not as if the dictator needed a war to distract the Italian population from internal Italian affairs. Mussolini was secure in power and enjoyed the approval of the Italian people. It was not a war that Italy could particularly afford, and Abyssinia was not a colony worth having for its wealth. It was not that Abyssinia was the target of a rival imperial power. The world recognized that the remote African kingdom was in Italy's sphere of interest. There is probably no simpler answer than the vanity of Benito Mussolini. Thus did one man's ego determine the fate of a nation. How is the invasion of Abyssinia, a faraway country of which Europeans knew little, a step on the path to war? The answer is in the damage the Abyssinian affair wrought upon the League of Nations. Abyssinia was a member of the League. Selassie made a dignified appeal for help. The League debated action and imposed limited economic sanctions, but stopped short of the one sanction which even in the 1930s was the most damaging, the cutting of oil supplies to Italy. Before any further action could be taken, the League was presented with the fait accompli of an Italian victory. Mussolini proclaimed the Italian king, the new emperor of Abyssinia. Hitler watched these events at a distance. Germany, although not a member of the League, scrupulously observed the sanctions against the Italians. Hitler watched the inability to act, to agree action against aggression, and decided on his next move: the reoccupation of the Rhineland. The Treaty of Versailles forbade Germany from placing troops opposite the French border. On March 7, 1936, Hitler ordered his army to cross the Rhine. It was a gamble. Had France decided to go to war, Germany had not yet built up its strength to have any chance of resisting invasion. It was a gamble Hitler won. France would not start a war alone. The British public would not countenance military action. The British did not think in terms of giving in to Hitler, rather that the Germans were simply justified retaking full control of their own territory. The reoccupation of the Rhineland has been described as the real end of World War I and its aftermath. After this time, Germany ceased to right the wrongs of Versailles and moved to aggressive expansion. From the perspective of generations later, it's hard to realize the novelty of Hitler's tactics in the international politics of the 1930s. The whole ethos after World War I was disarmament and arms control, a world where politicians hid their strength, said they had less guns, tanks, and aircraft, where nations hid the fact that they were building larger ships. In 1934, in the British Parliament, there had been angry exchanges between Prime Minister Baldwin and maverick backbencher Winston Churchill over the true size of the German Air Force. Churchill wildly and wrongly claimed that the Germans had a secret air force already many times stronger than the RAF. Hitler turned this world upside down and claimed a greater strength than he had. In a paranoid climate of alleged secret forces, nobody ever suspected a country would overstate its strength. In 1936, civil war broke out in Spain. In 1931, Spain, an old-fashioned, traditional country, had become a republic, and a process of change and reform begun. Conservative Spain was alarmed by the changes, and in 1936 the election of a government of communists and socialists caused elements of the army to break out in open rebellion. Whether this revolt was part of a grand fascist conspiracy is doubtful. The Spanish generals were too aware of their country's long history as a great power to be anybody's puppets. Rebel leader Francisco Franco was not a fascist, rather an old-fashioned conservative who valued patriotism and religion, a man who looked to the values of the past rather than some revolutionary future. Yet the Italians and the Germans supported Franco, sending planes, soldiers, and arms. Both desired to discredit democracy and used Spain as a testing ground for new weapons. Neither was prepared to risk war over Spain. Both were prepared to back down had Britain and France opposed the fascist intervention. Neither of the democracies wanted to become involved. Both feared the war would grow into a general European war. Once again, Hitler bluffed, and the democracies backed away. Soviet Russia supported the Republican government out of solidarity with the Communists, who increasingly came to dominate the direction of the Republican War, and also out of a hard-nosed decision to create mayhem on the far side of Europe, distracting and dividing would-be enemies. The war might have ended quickly with defeat of Franco's rebels had the democracies supported the legitimate government. It might have ended quickly had the strict neutrality Britain and France imposed been likewise observed by the fascists and communists. As it was, the fighting dragged on for 3 more years. 3 years of increasing brutality on both sides. Franco's troops killing anyone of even the most liberal opinion. A third of Spain's clergy, monks, nuns, and priests, were killed for their faith by the Republicans. The Spanish Civil War has gained a special place in history. To this day, no account seems capable of telling the story of Spain without partisanly refighting the battles. The mythology of the International Brigade, the few thousands of young left-wing idealists from the democracies who joined to fight fascism, paints the war in a romantic light. But Spain represented a conflict as isolated from Europe as the country itself. Subsequent history shows Spain remaining resolutely neutral in the European war. If there was a Nazi plot, Hitler gained little benefit. Some of those young men who fought for the Republican cause were from the United States. America as a nation was as resolutely neutral over the issue of Spain as any other. Without the United States, the history of World War II would not be complete. But America is the empty space upon the world stage of the interwar period. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, America gazed inward to its own complex society. While American ideas had been responsible for much of the idealism that permeated Versailles, the Congress of the U.S. refused to ratify the treaty. America was to have nothing to do with the League, nothing to do with policing the system of security that the treaty created. America had vast problems of its own, dealing with the economic chaos of the Great Depression and the Wall Street crash. It was chaos that affected industry and agriculture alike, causing mass unemployment and huge internal movements of population. It was a time of civil unrest, with mass protests before the White House. General Douglas MacArthur earned himself a different niche in history, as he commanded U.S. troops to prepare to fire on U.S. citizens. A bizarre side street of history is that in 1930, many serious strategic thinkers and military experts thought that if any major war were to break out in the world in the next 10 years, it would most likely be contested between the United States and Great Britain. The isolationism of the U.S. was traditional in a society 2 oceans away from the rest of the world. In 1932, a new type of politics came to power in America with the election of Democrat Franklin Roosevelt.
It looks, my friends, like a real landslide this time.
In the New Deal, American interests were ever more closely focused on affairs at home and not across the seas. America was, in fact, to become the most deadly enemy of Hitler in the coming war. The underestimation of America was the Nazi dictator's greatest mistake. America was held by Hitler to be a country of no threat, racially weak, dominated by Jews, contaminated by its African-American population. The isolationism of the United States was reflected in its military strength. The USA could threaten no nation in the 1930s. While Germany thought the restricted 100,000-man army an insult, the United States Army was freely kept by Congress at around 135,000. Weak forces meant the views of the USA, even had she chosen to speak, would have been of little import. In 1935, Congress reinforced the wall against the world by passing the Neutrality Acts. These laws were the products of a conspiracy theory that U.S. arms manufacturers had engineered America's entry to the First World War. The new laws prevented U.S. arms sales to any nation at war. If Hitler paid little interest in the USA, across another ocean, the Empire of Japan viewed America with envy and aggression. The place of Japan and China in the build-up to the outbreak of war is often neglected. On the other side of the world, great movements of people and ideas were unfolding, acts perpetrated involving astounding cruelty and inhumanity. Huge conspiracies and war plans were forming in Japan. In 1926, a new emperor ascended the chrysanthemum throne, Hirohito. As was and remains the custom, a name was chosen for the era of the new monarch's reign. This was to be the Showa, the era of illustrious peace. The coming years were to bring anything but peace to the peoples of Japan and Asia. In the interwar years, Japan's miraculous transformation into a modern society seemed to be failing. There was economic depression, high unemployment, and rural poverty. Japan had sided with the victorious powers in World War I, yet gained little from the peace. The abandonment of democracy by European states, such as Italy and Germany, seemed to hint to some Japanese that they too should abandon the foreign ideas and return to a traditional society. Expansion from the crowded Japanese islands, islands that lacked the resources needed to power a modern industrial society, seemed a way out of the problems of recession and unemployment. Japan eyed China covetously, resenting European powers exploiting the wealth of the region. Japan came to be allied with the fascist powers, but was not a fascist country. Economic need and greed were integrated with a traditional mythology to create a unique worldview. Japanese society at all levels between the wars became permeated with an ideology of Japanese racial superiority, the God Emperor giving the Japanese race a distinction over other peoples who had lost their link with the divine. This ideology saw a future war in which enlightened Japanese liberated the less fortunate of Asia, and a war of world domination that would be fought against the United States. As a developed industrial country, Japan shared in the industrialized nation's exploitation of China. Various treaties had allowed these countries concessions of territory inside China, with the right to station troops. The British territory of Hong Kong was the model. From this presence, Japan planned to expand. In 1931, Japan had faked an attack by Chinese troops upon Japanese forces in Manchuria. In retaliation, the Army of Japan invaded and conquered the Chinese province, renaming it Manchukuo, and installing a puppet government headed by the last emperor of China, Puyi. With this vindication of their aggressive expansionist policy, the military gained more power, becoming the dominant force of Japanese policy. The invasion of Manchuria is a major landmark on the timeline to war. It was the first blow in the death of 1,000 cuts that was inflicted upon the League of Nations. A whole year after the Japanese completed their conquest, the League issued a report, carefully and worthily written, that condemned Japan's action. Nothing happened. Japan left the League. This was a whole year before Hitler's rise to power. In November 1936, fearful of Russian communist ambition in the Far East, Japan formed a pact with Germany and Italy, the Anti-Comintern Pact, directed against communist expansion. This was not a relationship of great trust or shared ideology, more of expedience and fear of a common enemy. Japan knew that Nazism's white supremacism could never be reconciled with their own racial supremacy. In 1937, full war broke out between China and Japan. The reason again, a faked attack by China upon Japanese troops. The Chinese, led by the aggressive Chiang Kai-shek, fought back. The war was to be long and vicious from the very start. In December 1937, the Chinese capital of Nanking fell. As many as perhaps as 1/3 Chinese were killed in an orgy of murder, rape, torture, and looting. In 1937, 1/2 of the World War had already begun. Chinese historians believe this was the start of World War II. Stalin's Russia seemed the exception in a Europe full of states that had some grievance at the end of World War I. Russia's interest in international affairs was cautious and pragmatic, designed mainly to ensure no great coalition of capitalism was formed against Bolshevism. This was the time of the mass industrialization of the Soviet Union, of the 5-year plans. These years were the years of the purges. Every Russian, including Stalin, living in paranoid terror, fearing the enemy at home, and dreading betrayal, denunciation, imprisonment in a labor camp, or summary execution. Millions were to die and disappear. Of course, in the despotic terror of Stalinism lay a fearful dilemma for the democracies, which explains much of what has come to be called appeasement. In the 1930s, who was worse, Hitler or Stalin? To Western Europe, Bolshevism seemed far the greater evil, and Hitler at least a stern anti-communist. The actions of the politicians who wore suits, the Democrats who faced Hitler, are the counterparts to Nazi aggression. The mythic history of the war condemns them as appeasers, weakly giving in to Hitler's lies. The truth, though, is more complex. As soon as the Versailles Treaty was agreed, because the victorious powers had no sanction other than renewed war, negotiation, concession, compromise, appeasement became the way of dealing with problems. At the start of the 1930s, British policy was in the hands of James Ramsay MacDonald, Britain's first socialist prime minister and a man who had been an active pacifist in the First World War. MacDonald believed Germany had fair grievances that deserved redress. His successor from 1932 was Stanley Baldwin, a placid, uncharismatic man who refused to be panicked by Hitler's aggression and thought the French hysterical and paranoid. If British policy was determined by men who thought Germany deserved better treatment and who refused to get upset by Hitler, French policy was determined by more complex emotions. The French felt aggrieved and threatened by Germany, yet were paralyzed by a cynical defeatism that prevented a positive action against Nazism. They refused to act without British help, convinced war was coming but that nothing positive could be done. Their view of the world came to be expressed in spectacular physical form. The French were to devote incredible sums of money in the second half of the 1930s to the construction of the Maginot Line. Named after the French war minister who conceived the plan, the line was a complex of futuristic fortifications. The line ran from Switzerland to the Luxembourg and Belgian border and was designed to deter German attack. The great weakness of the line was that it did not extend across all France's western border. It was thought impolitic to extend the forts against the Belgians, a friendly and neutral country. Nearly 500,000 French troops inhabited underground cities of war, manning huge ammunition stores, deep armored bunkers with underground roads and railways. The rigidity of the Maginot Line reflected the French strategic mind. People who gaze into the future too often only see their past, and France could not imagine a future war which did not begin with a German attack in the West upon France. While building its wall in the West, France made defensive alliances in the East. But with what states did France make these defensive alliances? Czechoslovakia and Poland. Small countries, weak countries, countries that had scores with whom Hitler had grievance, countries that had German minorities, had German territory. Poland was notoriously unstable and aggressive, with delusions of great power and status. These alliances would be more likely to drag France into a war as deter Germany. Not all politicians in the democracies were appeasers. In Great Britain, Winston Churchill constantly warned that Nazism would in the end bring a huge war. In Churchill's story, once again, the history and mythology of the war grind past each other. In the 1930s, Churchill was thought a dangerous eccentric, who, by his constant calls for more arms, was likely to bring about war. Churchill already had a long history in British politics and not a history covered in glory. As a cabinet minister in World War I, he was forced to resign over disastrously conceived campaigns which had cost thousands of lives. As peacetime chancellor, finance minister, he had been forced to resign over catastrophic mishandling of the economy, causing economic chaos. Churchill was, in many ways, hopelessly out of step in the 1930s, a die-hard conservative with a mind closed to new ideas. Churchill was trusted by almost no one, thought an unprincipled man, a politician who had changed parties cynically for personal gain. That history has vindicated Churchill makes it hard for us to realize that 1930s Britain feared him and saw the pragmatic common sense of the British government prepared to deal with Hitler as the right way forward. In May 1937, Neville Chamberlain became British Prime Minister. Chamberlain has a sad place in the history of the war. The wisdom of hindsight and the mythology of the war makes him arch-appeaser, the betrayer of small countries, the mirror of weakness against Churchill's strength. If we are to judge this man, let us ask ourselves, would we, in our turn, as people of reason and fairness, not attempt everything possible to avoid the recurrence of war? Would we really follow the insane ravings of Churchill? Chamberlain was a sharp contrast to his predecessor, Baldwin, who placidly drifted through international affairs. Chamberlain, despite the appearance of a 19th century gentleman, had a keen mind, was a competent administrator who really could achieve in government. He came to office determined to get things done, to resolve rather than ignore problems. Today, appeasement is a dirty word, synonymous with insipid surrender. In the 1930s, it was the problem, not the enemy, that was appeased. Appeasement meant negotiation and compromise. Chamberlain was a determined and principled man who simply pursued what everybody, politician and citizen alike, saw as the sensible way to do things. Some historians see the German annexation of Austria in 1938 as the start of the countdown to World War II, all previous events being the undoing of the punishments laid upon Germany at Versailles. The union of Austria and Germany, the Anschluss, went beyond any restitution and was aggressively expansive. Nazism believed all German people should be members of the same state, and Hitler himself had been born Austrian. The Anschluss would increase Germany's base of population and industrial strength, making further expansion possible. It would be the first move in pushing Germany's frontier to the east, which Hitler believed Germany's destiny. The Austrian Nazis were in constant ferment and agitation against the Austrian government. There was a history of violence and assassination, of threatened and attempted coups. In 1936, Austrian Chancellor Schuschnigg had made what was ironically called a gentleman's agreement with Hitler. Concessions were made to the Nazis, yet the agitation continued. 2 years later, in February 1938, Hitler and Schuschnigg met again, and it was agreed that a Nazi sympathizer be made minister in charge of Austrian security. The Austrian government saw this as part of a gradual taking over of Austria and proposed a vote on Anschluss. With the reoccupation of the Rhineland, Hitler had bluffed his strength. Now German troops began to really mass on the Austrian border, to intervene, to prevent chaos and anarchy in Austria. For perhaps the first time in history, an international crisis was conducted over the telephone. Schuschnigg and the Austrians, who wished to retain independence, tried to rally support among the leaders of Europe. In a series of phone calls, they found no one would support Austria. Britain and France thought war not a price worth paying, accurately sensing that most Austrian people were not opposed to Anschluss. As German troops entered Austria, they were received with wild enthusiasm. Hitler as a hero. Austria was incorporated as part of the Third Reich. Hitler's plan had been to take control of Austria slowly, by the same methods as in Germany, by first using and then dissolving democracy, creating a puppet state. As he received the adulation of the Austrian people as a whirlwind of history gathered around Europe, perhaps even Hitler thought that the pace of time was accelerating towards a destiny that might not be in any man's total control. Next time on World War II, The Complete History, it's the turn of the state of Czechoslovakia to face the might of Hitler's ambition and wrath. In the defining moment of the 1930s, Neville Chamberlain flies to Munich to resolve the crisis. The great powers of Europe meet to decide the fate of the small Central European country. The Czechs wait outside to be told their fate. Events that history judge as betrayal, as the definitive appeasement, are lauded by the peoples of the world. Chamberlain returns to London a hero. He promises peace in our time. Too soon, the climate of ecstatic relief and joy dissolves, as it's realized that Hitler will not keep his word. A grim realism seizes Europe as Britain and France begin to rearm. The Eastern ambition and hunger of Hitler grows as his gaze falls upon the remainder of Czech lands. The nation of Czechoslovakia dissolves. All over Europe, there is a fatalistic certainty that war is coming. Poland is the subject of Hitler's mystical belief and territorial avarice in a move which shocks the world. Nazism and Soviet communism form an unholy alliance that seals Poland's fate. Enmeshed by alliances disguised as protections, France and Britain are committed to aid Poland, and war breaks out.